So I'm just got one anyways. I hope everybody enjoyed the reception last night. I know I did. I really appreciate the people who made the Code4Lib sign and lights. Excellent job, whoever's work that was. I'm Eric Pettiplace, and I'm going to be your MC this morning. I, like Dre, am not much of a singer, and I'm not going to start you off with Becky's Good Morning song, but I did think it would be appropriate to read a poem that has recently been added to the public domain. So as probably a lot of people know, things have started coming into the public domain again. That's pretty wonderful. Yeah. Shout out to that. All right. So the YouTube stream can't get shut down for me reading this. That's kind of cool. This is a Robert Frost poem. It's kind of sad for the morning, but we'll bear through that. You know, sip your coffee, meditate. Nothing gold can stay. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, so nothing gold can say. Okay, now let's get into the announcements. There are going to be breakout sessions in the afternoon and lightning talks this morning following the break after our planned talks. There are sign-out sheets in the lobby, the same place that they were yesterday, so they're by the registration tables. Please go pitch your ideas, particularly if you're doing a lightning talk. There's not a whole lot of time, so you do want to get out there and sign up either right now, while you can just ignore what I'm saying, or if there's a talk that you're not interested in a little bit. I am going to ask that the people who do lightning talks, if you're going to use Google Slides, that's fine, but we ask that you either don't use presentation notes or you export to PowerPoint. That just makes the transition between speakers easier because we don't have to switch display modes on the laptop computer, which can cause a little bit of delay. So thank you for doing that. The community support volunteers this morning are Karen Coyle and Wayne Graham. They are located in the back of the room and have the zebra striped lanyards. Karen and Wayne, if you could just stand for a moment so people can see where you're at. Karen's not here yet, but she will be here. So, okay. And the online support volunteer is Megan Kudzia. That's M Kudzia on Slack, MKUDZIA. I would like to thank our gold sponsors this morning, Index Data and OCLC. The sponsors help us put on the conference. Very valuable contribution. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you. I'd also like to congratulate our 2019 Diversity Scholarship recipients. To me, the Diversity Scholarship is one of the definitive elements of Code4Lib. It's something that sets us apart, much like our Code of Conduct. It's something that we were doing early and have really put a lot of work into as a community. So it's a special part of Code4Lib. And I'm just going to read off these names and congratulate these people. So Meredith Broadway, Elena Colon Marrero, Kelsey George, Puget Qualara, Sarah Nugent, Nikki O'Neill, Anne Serrano, Sarah Swans, Althea Topek, Rachel Wang, Yasi Alechko, Molly Higgins. So a big round of applause for those people. And thank you to all of our sponsors that made the diversity scholarships possible. That's OCLC, MIT Libraries, LibTech Women, UC San Diego Library, Oregon State University Libraries and Press, Temple University Libraries, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign School of Information Sciences, and the generous individuals that donated to the Angel Fund with its matching donation. So thank you all. Okay, we are ready to get into this talks. There will be perhaps some giveaways after break. I'm not sure, actually. So stay tuned. Very, very tense. But the first talk this morning is going to be Teresa Hebron doing aggregation without aggravation, auditing metadata at scale. Teresa, are you here? Excellent.
Good morning, everyone. All right. So yeah, good morning. Welcome back to day 2. Looks like the room is about as full as it was yesterday, so it's great to see everyone back here. I hope everyone's got their morning beverage of choice. I used to always say coffee until I moved to a place where coffee is not the standard morning beverage of choice, believe it or not. And this is Aggregation Without Aggravation, Auditing Metadata at Scale. I'm Teresa Hebron, and I'm with Mountain West Digital Library. So as I started thinking about this presentation, this project, I came upon the analogy of Jeopardy! I'm a big Jeopardy! Fan, even though Alex Trebek seems like he's always really snarky when he has librarian contestants. I don't know if anyone else has ever noticed that. I hear some laughing, so I'm guessing yes. But so I thought it was apt because I think as technologists or people who work with technology in libraries, a lot of times we want to just throw technology at an issue without maybe necessarily understanding what the question is. And I was really appreciating what Noah said yesterday in his presentation about programming being an inquiry rather than a solution by itself. So to that end, I decided I would tell you about Mountain West Digital Library a little bit by giving you the quote-unquote answers up front, and then we'll talk about the questions. So answers being Hawaii, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, Utah, Wyoming, 17 OAI PMH compliant digital repositories, and 80 plus cultural heritage institutions. So what are the questions that go with these? First, what states does Mountain West represent? And I feel like I always have to explain this. So we're the DPLA service hub and a regional digital library for 6 Western states, and Hawaii is included in that because Brigham Young University, which is in Utah, has a campus in Hawaii. But I always feel like I have to stick up for them. And when they came to visit us last spring, they said, well, what's to question? We have mountains, and we're the most western state in the United States. So for them, it was just a done deal. Then from how many repositories does MWDL harvest content? It's 17, and it was really tricky for me to get the wording of that question correct as I was writing this so that it wasn't like with the incorrect grammar. And finally, how many institutions does MWDL represent? So currently our member network is over 80 cultural heritage institutions, and that includes universities, archives, public libraries, historical societies, a few state parks, museums, and other institutions as well. So if we multiply 6 by 17 by 80, I don't know if anyone's quick at math, I'm not, that's why I'm a librarian. That's 8,160 combinations, and that's pretty much anyone to make, enough to make anyone make the surprised Kevin face when they start thinking about the scale of the data that we're looking at here. So when you're talking about an aggregated data environment, of course, the first and obvious thing is to put some rules around things. What fields do we require? What format do they have to be in? And you think that rules and guidelines help make things more clear, right? But it is a lot of metadata that we're talking about, and our metadata application profile that's been in effect since 2011 has 8 required fields, which I won't read to you here. And then there's another set of, quote, mandatory if applicable fields, and then some that are recommended. So if you're, again, quick at math and you're multiplying 8,000 something by 8 by another 10 to 12, that comes out to being, I don't know, 65,000 something, on the conservative side of things. And you're probably thinking, that sounds a lot like Tales from the Meat data. And I say meat data because last spring I got this text from a friend of mine who is a librarian who became a knowledge manager, and she said, I've been typing metadata all morning in a document, and I just realized I was spelling it meat data. Because if you misspell metadata, it is meat data. But I adopted this as a term I use for data that's not correct, basically, metadata that's not correct. And a big shout out to Scotty Carlson, who took my incoherent hallway ramblings last fall at DLF and turned it into this amazing graphic. You should all talk to him, he's great. So when we're thinking about our metadata or our meat data, and I have to say, Dominic's comment about wild JSON files also, rang true to me. There's a lot of ideas about metadata assessment and what we consider quality metadata, right? Is it complete? Is it correct? Is there consistency? Is it timely? But honestly, the one we use probably most frequently at MWDL is completeness. So then the question becomes, how can we assess hundreds of collections, and I'm talking upwards of 700 now, that range in size from sometimes just a single record in a collection to tens of thousands of records at a time, for that completeness in an efficient kind of way. So luckily, our fellow DPLA Service Hub, North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, coded and released a DPLA OAI aggregation tool on GitHub in 2014. And then Mountain West launched its own version of that in late 2015. So this tool uses XSL to test incoming OAI PMH feeds and gives a visual presentation of the results in a web-based tool. So Mountain West's previous director, Sandra McIntyre, who's now with HathiTrust, reworked that original project to test OAI feeds against our required fields from our metadata application profile. And the first version of the audit tool was born. So this here is a screenshot of that tool. It offered just basically two features. It was a mapping checker, so a full visual output of all the data that was in a particular OAI set. And then a required data checker, so basically a completeness checker for metadata. And that would check against both simple and qualified Dublin Core outputs coming from Content DM repositories. So, the end. Not really. Long story short, it worked great. No one died of dysentery like an Oregon Trail. But then, of course, as things always do, things changed. So between when that original version of the tool was launched and when I came on board in early 2018, the landscape of what Mountain West's members were using began to shift around. We have a couple members now who are using Islandora and another one who's looking or in the process of migrating to Islandora. We wanted to bring on a new member, Oregon Digital, who are using Simvera repository, and please, Slack feed, don't freak out about the fanged rodent. We have another one who's using Novation. And then our biggest contributor, our biggest single contributor of records, the University of Utah itself, where we're headquartered, decided to go way off script and make their own repository. And there's some people here who could tell you a lot about that, and not me. So long story short, we had to turn and face the strange like David Bowie and get on with things. So going back to my earlier Jeopardy analogy, it was clear to me that we had the answer already. We knew what we wanted to do. We just needed to reformulate the question. So we needed to figure out what needed to be changed with our tool to make it parse these new and different feeds correctly. So what we see here is an example of a qualified Dublin Core field from a Content DM member, Utah State Archives. And what you probably will notice here is that the elements are formatted DC : element name, and then the qualified terms are prefixed DC terms element name. And that's consistent across Content DM feeds. But then if we compare it with an incoming feed from Oregon Digital using Simvera, we see something that's quite different. So here, each of their elements is prefixed to DC terms and then the element name. So what happened was when we would try to check a particular set with the old tool, it basically caused a false positive for every single record, or as I like to call it, we got some splode code. So what do we need to do? As I said before, like Jeopardy, we already had the answer. This is a screenshot of the XSL variable definitions in the existing tool that was for qualified Dublin Core from Content DM. And we can see here the pieces that are bolded were what needed to be updated. So then from there, it was pretty easy to ask the question, what updates need to be made? So that resulted, of course, in a new answer of being an organ-specific set of XSL that could test their qualified Dublin core feed without exploding. So again, not quite the end of the story, but pretty good. So as with all systems projects, there was an elephant in the room, literally, which was, how do we test this thing? This is a public tool. Any of our members can use it. It's on the web. And I didn't want to release it without it being tested first, of course. So one of my colleagues suggested using MAMP, which is a free web server tool, which led to actually using it through VMware Fusion, which is a virtual machine software. And go ahead and grow now. It was because of IT restrictions at the library on what you could download or not. So that was what led to using the virtual machine. But all in all, it worked pretty well. The testing was pretty smooth in that we did flush out a couple of hiccups, a couple really bonehead typos that I had made. If you misspell rights, it turns out it doesn't work at all, for example. And then I actually found out when I was poking around in the code of the tool that there was another whole feature that hadn't been enabled, which was, it's called a facet checker, and it shows the relative number of records in a given field that use a certain value, which can be handy when you're doing metadata auditing, for example. So if you look in there and you find out that you have 5 records where you misspelled one of your subject headings, it's a chance to go ahead and correct that before you release things into the wild. So after a couple of iterations with the VMware Fusion, it was ready to be made live. Thanks to our IT support, we got it live. We moved it to a different server that was a little more modern. We gave it a more modern URL that was more branded to MWDL than what we had had before. So of course, no systems discussion I feel like would be complete without a pro and con discussion. So pros, as anybody who's ever audited a lot of metadata at one time knows, it's kind of like driving a bus sometimes. You can't really turn or stop very quickly. So being able to audit collections that are of different sizes, that are coming from different places, is pretty great. Another thing is accuracy. Before we started using this tool, the previous metadata librarian was relying on doing a visual sampling of people's OAI feeds, so basically just visually scanning XML in a browser and making recommendations to members about necessary remediations to be ready to be harvested. So this tool, though, is able to check every single record in a particular OAI set, and we're able to provide targeted record-level feedback about improvement and remediation that needs to be made ahead of harvesting. And then finally, flexibility. So having a web-based tool like this means that members can do their own auditing during the description process if they like, and also non-professional staff can be deployed to be doing some sort of auditing tasks as well. I have a student worker, for example, who works with me who does a lot of low-level checking on sets as they're coming in and we get harvest requests in. And the same is true out at our member network as well. We actually are in the process of redoing our metadata application profile and did a survey recently where we did ask how many full-time employees do you have working on metadata description for digital collections. And I would say out of the 16 members, the average is about 1 to 2. So even having a student worker or a part-timer who can come in and do some of this type of work really extends the capability at all the member institutions. And of course, everything is not always roses. So there are a few cons as well. Somewhat ironically, speed is also a con. And I say that because XSL testing is not necessarily fast. And there are a lot of speed issues that can result from the response times of the underlying repositories that we're testing. So if you call up an OAI set in a browser window and it's really slow to render, it's going to be even slower in the tool, for example. The outside performance time I think I ever saw was about an hour to render a set, but that said, it was about 10,000 plus records, which thankfully after all of that work, it came back very clean and there was only just a couple of records that really needed to be updated. Another possible downfall that I had not even thought of, at a conference last fall, someone asked me, well, this thing looks great, but it doesn't look like you can save the results from the checking. And I said that's true. So the results that render in your browser screen are completely temporal, of course. There's no downloading. And I have to admit, I've gotten a little bit impatient sometimes and like been clicking around in my browser and accidentally clicked the X on that tab and then had to do it all over again. So you really have to be a little bit patient with it. And then finally, as I've alluded to many times, things are always changing. Members are always going to keep migrating to new systems. We are in the process of updating our application profile right now, so I think if I look down the track of 2019, we're probably going to have to make some more adaptations to this tool to allow for possibly relaxed metadata standards or adding or subtracting fields, depending on what the task force decides on with that. So I've spoken very speedily, not like Keanu Reeves with this bus. And that brings me to the end. This is the address of our tool. If you'd like to take a look at it or try out a feed, it will probably explode on you if you're not a member. I'm at Ednev's Archives on Twitter. And this is my email address, and I would be happy to take questions. Thank you. Oh, we have one here in the front.
Hello.
Hi.
So I was on a project, consortial project where they decided to use a tool called Repox. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you or your team looked at that also, and I'm curious if you would recommend the DPLA, OAI, PMH tools over that, or what the differences are.
Sure. I'm not familiar enough with Repox to say which I would recommend. I will say this tool is pretty good for our purpose in that we use a third-party vendor tool to do our harvesting and our display layer, whereas I understand Repox to be its own repository, I believe. But I think you probably could use something like this externally depending on how you were doing your ingests into Repox. All right, I don't see any more hands, so I will say thank you.
Okay, next up we have Ilya Kramer with Web Recorder, developing an open source high fidelity web archiving toolset.
Hi everyone, it's really great to be here. It's my first Code4Lib. I don't work for the library, but I work at a arts nonprofit that is trying to make tools for people that work at libraries. And so I want to talk about Web Recorder, which is a project that I've been working on for the past several years. And so what is Web Recorder? It's basically a set of open source archiving tools. It's also a hosted service that we run on webrecord.io. And what it does is it provides browser-based capture and access focusing on high-fidelity web archives. And I'll show in a bit what that means exactly. And one of the goals of Web Recorder is to really provide web archiving for everyone. I like to say web archiving for all, and make web archiving accessible to folks who aren't usually able to do web archiving. And it's stewarded by Rhizome, which is an arts nonprofit based in New York. And we have a team of 6 people working on Web Recorder currently, and we've been supported by the Mellon Foundation, who we're really grateful for their support through 2 grants. And so before I demo Web Recorder itself, I want to kind of briefly present how it's different from traditional web archiving, which is usually crawler-based, and popular tool is called Heritrix. And the way that works is that there's usually a list of URLs called seeds, and those seeds are loaded, and then the crawler loads the URLs and then parses HTML, finds more URLs to load, and then that traffic is stored into a losslet format called work. And of course, it's easy to parse HTML, so it's fast, and it's easy to crawl a lot of content in bulk. But downside is that this approach is mostly inadequate for modern websites because Well, because of JavaScript. So pretty much most modern websites are not going to be accurately captured with this traditional approach. And so what Web Recorder does is it allows users to capture directly through the browser. And real quickly, what is a work file? And basically a standard format that's used by web archives, basically byte-level capture of HTTP request and response traffic. And there's optional metadata records. And it's used by many institutions, including Internet Archive. And Web Recorder also supports this format. And I'll just go ahead and do refresh this and go to a demo. And so here's Web Recorder running on webrecorder.io. And what I can do is, so I'll have we'll select and starting with something simple, I'll just enter the Code4Lib website here. And as you can see, the Code4Lib site loaded here, and there's a size counter. So we've already recorded 30 kilobytes here. You can click, and the size counter is going up. Again, this is nothing too fancy yet. We're just essentially recording directly what's being loaded in the browser. And we can also click, for example, on these other links here. For example, if we click on, let's see. This will take us to Code4Lib GitHub, and so now we're at 600K here. We can also go back, or we could just stop. So if I click on stop, here you'll see a list of URLs that have been recorded so far. Yeah, so I can click on this, and then instantly I can play back the content that's been recorded. And I could also download the entire collection as a work file. So I won't do that on this computer. And so another thing that Web Recorder can do is, so I've been recording through this browser, but let's say I want to, let's say I want to go to a page that has Flash. So Flash is no longer supported, so you might see something like this. For that, we have another system in Web Recorder where you could actually select from one of preserved browsers that we have. And so I'll go ahead and select Firefox 67 and go back to my Code4Lib collection. Let's see here. Oh, that's okay. And I'll just record that here. And so now we're actually loading this page in a specific version of Firefox. So I'm running Chrome on Windows, and inside of it, it's loading Firefox with Flash installed. And I can actually browse a Flash-based project through this remote browser. And this is a browser running remotely in a container. And then I can stop that, and I can also then view the collection in the same browser. And so another example of, well, this is actually my bug reports collection. So, but I will go to, let's see here. So another thing that we've been working on recently is how to make this easier for folks to actually to create these high fidelity web archives. And so just something else here, and so now I'll load the Code4Lib hashtag in Chrome 67, and I'll just click on latest. And we have this new feature. This is not yet out for everyone. We're still testing this. Is the ability to automate a particular site. And so what's happening now is that this remote browser is automatically clicking on all of the tweets and also scrolling as it's through the entire timeline. Yeah, so if I can just let this go, it'll slowly go through the entire timeline, and again, you can see the size counter going up. This is really key because with dynamic pages like Twitter, if you don't actually click on the tweet, they won't get captured. And that's the case for many single page apps as well. And so I'll probably stop the demo here, although maybe I'll do one more so we can, we've been working on a few, so let's see here. So another example is SoundCloud. And again, our senior developer, John, has been working on these custom behaviors, and kind of a shout out to him, because this is a kind of a complicated system, and I'll talk a little bit more about it. And so here we actually have SoundCloud, and what it's doing here is it's loading each track, and it's making sure that it's fully captured before scrolling. And you can see the size counter here going up pretty quickly. And if I actually turn on the sound, there'll be sound coming from the browser as well. Okay, so I'll stop right here and kind of return to. So that was kind of a brief demo of Web Recorder's capabilities, and so kind of what's the one of the points of this is that web archiving does not have to mean archiving the entire web. So I've archived a few different pages that are each a few kilobytes or megabytes even, and so it's perfectly fine for web archives to be small, and web archives contain bounded objects that are essentially a particular site, a particular project that might be placed in an institutional collection, for example. It doesn't have to be an entire huge multi-gigabyte web crawl. And so our focus is on quality over quantity, so obviously this is kind of very focused, but you can see that it's getting all the high fidelity, including the dynamic content, the sound for audio and so forth, and of course all of this is open source, and you can run Web Recorder at your institutions today. And so I'll talk a little bit about the open source tools. And the Web Recorder contains a componentized architecture, mostly Python and a little bit of JavaScript. And there's lots of tools for developers. And so I've shown a lot of different things very quickly. And so I'll try to break it down a little bit. And so if you just want to create work files, let's say just starting with the very basics, for that we have the work.io library, and it's a small Python package for creating work files, and you can actually use it to create a work file in 4 lines of Python with this, try to keep it as simple as possible. So if you want to load a single URL, that's all you need to package it up into a work file. Of course, it won't contain any embeds, it'll contain just that URL, and that can be done with this little script. And then, so the core engine behind Web Recorder is called PyWB, also known as Python Wayback / Web Archive Toolkit. And essentially all of the core functionality behind Web Recorder, the capture and the replay, is found in PyWB. And so let's say you want to archive a page through a browser. Well, that could be done with this 4-line script, assuming you have Google Chrome installed. And you could actually record it either through the prefix mode, where the URLs are rewritten, or it could also be recorded through a proxy mode. And then if you want to host your own Wayback Machine or provide access to what was just captured, well, that's also doable with a 4-line script. And same idea, and kind of the goal of this is that the capture and the replay process is symmetrical as much as possible, so the entire tool chain is using the same code and then changes whether data is read from the live web or from a work file or a collection of work files. Okay, so that's the command line approach. Well, what if you want to have something simpler for your users to have and then browse web archives? Well, for that, we actually have a tool called Web Recorder Player, which is an Electron app that we have for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And the idea is that you could download a work file from Web Recorder and then you can click the, essentially, a point-and-click tool for users to start browsing a work file. And the UI is consistent with WebRecord.io, and we have releases on GitHub of the project. And so whenever we update WebRecord.io, we also update the desktop player, and the code is there as well. And it's like, well, what if you want a particular browser, such as one that contains Flash? Well, for that, we have the remote browser system, which originally was developed for a project called oldweb.today. And the idea there is that we put a browser in a Docker container, so each browser has its own Docker container, and we have several versions of Chrome and Firefox, such as the ones that I've shown in WebRecorder, and we also have additional older browsers, and there's additional Docker containers for VNC, for the VNC streaming, and WebRTC for audio. There's lots of code there. Still documentation is needed. And just to show that, I'll kind of talk a little bit while that's loading. So you could actually have the browser system without the web archive. So they're two separate components. And in this case, it'll take a little bit to load. So I'll just move on. Well, actually, where are we? This. So if you just want to use a browser for a particular, an older version of a browser, or just a containerized version of browser for preservation purposes, for later use and so forth, you could do that. So in this case, this is the remote browser that's running the very first browser ever. So it's loading a NextStep emulator, and it'll load the first WW browser. And so while that's going, I'll move on a little bit to, so if you want to make a custom behavior, such as what I showed for Twitter and SoundCloud, this is a brand new system. It's possible to have extensible per-site behaviors, and we're working on a library for users to build their own behaviors, and there's API and documentation coming soon, and let's check up on this. So next step is loading a little bit slowly, so but it's almost there. And so the idea with this is that it's running in VNC, and there's no audio in this case, but we also have audio through WebRTC currently, and this will actually start the. I think the CERN also announced that it was. I think it's the 30th anniversary, I believe, of the web. I think, and they actually recreated this in JavaScript, but it's also possible to run the original. And so the idea with this is that you can have any browser running and pass URLs to it through the URL in this way. And so with the behavior system, if you're interested in beta testing that for other sites besides, we're working on all the social media sites, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, SoundCloud, and kind of other big sites. And of course, this is still very new, but the idea is to have an extensible library for creating these behaviors that John is working on. If you want to try all of it, which is what I showed on WebRecord.io, we have our main web recorder repo, and it's fully containerized with Docker Compose. And what WebRecorder adds on top of the core kind of PyWB stuff is the user management system and a custom UI. And then we also have an API backend and a React front end, and all of that's available. And are there any other tools that we have? Actually, yes. We also have an Ansible cookbook or playbook actually for WebRecorder deployment. We have a utility called Workit, which can turn files on disk into work files that could then be used in WebRecorder. And we also have a small tool called Hard2Work, which converts HAR files, which are created by browsers through the dev tools, into work files. And those could also be loaded into WebRecorder. And so have we solved archiving? Well, fortunately not. There's many challenges that remain. There's WebSockets. HTTP2 is not really, there's no no exact solution for storing HTTP2 data currently, and then dynamic history and single-page apps are always difficult and problematic, and any kind of non-deterministic behavior, including pages that behave differently based on time lapsing and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done, but if you want to help, contributions are definitely welcome. And I've shared a bunch of different tools. Hopefully, if your institution is interested in web archiving or having institutional objects in institutional web archives, you can use Web Recorder to create those and put them into along with other institutional data. And all of this is available for everyone to use. So thank you. So, any questions?
Testing. There we go. I was at the Advancing Art Libraries and curated web archives last week, and we were talking just all about Archive It, Internet Archive solution, and it sounds like you're suggesting that this may be a better solution in terms of dealing with more modern websites and technologies. I just wonder if you could open up a little bit more the comparison between the two. And then I was also curious about where, if our library starts, capturing certain websites, like where do we store that on our own server, which would be like one of the big differences that I would see between the Internet Archive's offering.
Sure. Yeah, in fact, I know that many institutions actually use Web Recorder alongside with Archive It. Archive It is focusing on sort of larger scale and kind of automated crawling. And Web Recorder is focused on sort of slightly smaller scale and higher fidelity for dynamic content. And we actually have I didn't have a chance to demo it, but we actually have a feature that allows Web Recorder to patch an existing archive that's in another web archive, including Archive It. So you could actually enter an Archive It URL, and Web Recorder will load it and fill in anything that's missing from the live web and create what's called a patchwork that can then be put into Archive It. So that's one use. Of course, currently we have, there's no guarantee that that will work in Archive It. I think that our focus has definitely been on the fidelity, because we think that that's pretty key to preserving the modern web. Web Recorder is fully open source, whereas Archive It is not. So if that's important to you, then I would definitely encourage you to try out Web Recorder. As far as where to put work files, the current deployment is running on AWS, and that's S3 is supported out of the box right now. And of course, there's an extensible mechanism for if you wanted to store works into another repository, for example, that should be possible to do. So if you have a repository that you want to integrate with, that's something that we've definitely considered and would be possible to support.
Hello.
Any other questions?
So I was wondering could you talk about what is actually stored in a work file? Like, is it a snapshot of the DOM and its changes over time, or is it the actual JavaScript source and recording network requests and responses, or is it just video? I don't know what.
Yeah. Yes. So it's basically just, and I think I might have gone through it pretty quickly. It's essentially just the network raw request and response. So it's with additional metadata added as in the same format. So there's custom MIME headers followed by the raw HTTP request and response data, including we store all of the requests, including the post requests. Of course, there's things that we try to filter out certain, if there's, for example, if there's passwords that are submitted, we try to filter those out. Well, that's becomes a little bit tricky to detect what not to record. Kind of a whole other subject, but the idea is to record everything that goes through the browser or through a proxy. And yeah, if anyone has additional questions, you could talk to me or contact me on Twitter. And yeah, thank you.
Next up, we have Nathan Whitmire with GDPR for American Public Libraries. PowerPoint?
Yep.
Just close that one.
Okay. Okie dokie. Good morning. I'm here to talk about the EU's General Data Protection Regulation and its potential meaning for American libraries. The title is Public Libraries because that's my world. I realize that many of you are from academic libraries, so I tried to provide a little information that might apply there as well. This is part informational, part evangelism on my part, and also expect to see some vacation pictures sprinkled throughout. So first of all, I'm not the only privacy evangelist. Last month, the ALA's Governing Council added a new article to the Library Bill of Rights regarding privacy, and it reads, all people, regardless of origin, age, background, or views, possess a right to privacy and confidentiality in their library use. Libraries should advocate for, educate about, and protect people's privacy, safeguarding all library use data, including personally identifiable information. So let's go for a little walk and think, who owns the data about you? Whatever your passion, maybe it's bears or Elvis or a cactus, you can find out about it online. But who's watching you? What data do they have? And in this case, the person watching is me. That's my kids. Who does that data belong to? So we're living in the era of big data and the era of an ad-based revenue model for large internet companies. They provide services for free or low cost, and in exchange, they collect data. Facebook, Google, Amazon, many others collect large amounts of data about us. But what are the limits of this data collection? This data collection is framed as trading information for free services or cost reductions. But where are the lines drawn? What constitutes helpful, targeted advertising versus outright surveillance? Can content delivery informed solely by these data models and an advertising revenue model serve as propaganda? What roles do governments play in collecting this data, using this data, and mediating disputes about this data? And what roles do we in the libraries play? How does this environment impact libraries and the values that we express? Libraries, through the various articles of the Library Bill of Rights, have already made value judgments on many of these issues. My poor man's summary of the Library Bill of Rights, what we seek to do is provide all materials to all people without discrimination, support free expression of ideas and free access to information, fight censorship, and defend patrons' freedom from scrutiny of their reading and viewing as essential to intellectual freedom. So from the ALA's online privacy advocacy information, a lack of privacy in what one reads and views in a library can have a significant chilling effect upon library users' willingness to exercise their First Amendment right to read, thereby impairing free access to ideas. True liberty of choice in the library requires both a varied selection of materials and the assurance that one's choices are not monitored. So we'll repeat that, the assurance that one's choices are not monitored. So back to our environment. What is monitored? How is it monitored? Specific to libraries, what data do we collect ourselves, and what data do we enable others to collect on our patrons? Here's some examples. Google Analytics, the Facebook pixel, change logs, access logs, event registration records. Again, who does this information belong to? So into this environment comes the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. It went into full effect last May. You may recall receiving authorization emails for email subscriptions and the now ever-present cookie authorization pop-up. For the average user, this feels like little more than an annoyance, but it has the potential to mean a lot more. Back to that question, who owns the data about you? GDPR says you own it. If it is personal data, you are the owner. The regulation specifies different roles for different people. Roughly speaking, a data controller makes use of the data, and a data processor processes the data, but you are the owner. Processors and controllers are liable if they do not properly safeguard your data and honor your rights. This liability covers all people in the EU. So if we think about this, we've learned to accept that if Google creates a data set from my search for the ideal path from Royal Gorge in Colorado up to the Jasper Park in Canada to visit the glaciers there, or if Facebook stores a photo, they essentially own it. If I tell Facebook that I love Karen O and the yeah, yeah, yeahs, and I really do, then that information belongs to Facebook. But the GDPR comes in and says, no, the data is about you, it's yours. So the script is flipped. The GDPR is based in part on a philosophy of privacy and data management developed in Canada called Privacy by Design. So you can find out more about privacy by design by seeking out Dr. Anne Kavukian at Ryerson University in Toronto. But for our purposes, here's a quick rundown. This model instills the following principles: proactive, not reactive. Privacy is the default. So how do we build privacy into the systems from the start? Privacy embedded into design. No unnecessary trade-offs, which she refers to as positive sum. So rather than making a trade-off between privacy and security, how do we get both of those ends? End-to-end security, visibility and transparency, and a respect for user privacy. So the sunlight appears. So under the GDPR, you have several rights regarding your data. The right to know and permit, the right to object, the right to correct, the right to portability, moving from one system to another, the right to be forgotten. These are wonderful rights for you to be able to express, but actually, probably not you if you're an American in the US. So here, Library Conference, we just want to know, like, what do I need to know about this thing? Does this apply to me or not? So one significant innovation of the GDPR is that it covers people in the EU, even when the companies or organizations involved aren't in the EU. And it represents the power to assess large fines. Potentially, yes, you may need to be familiar with it. So questions that you might need to consider: do you serve people in the EU? If you're a university, does your university have students in Europe? Is your website used by EU residents, offering services or monitoring the behavior of EU residents? And point of information, there are some thresholds. One threshold is 250 employees or more. So some of the implications of the GDPR are clear and some are not. The regulation is structured to increase leverage on the largest players. So we've seen highly publicized suits against Google and Facebook, but this doesn't mean that small or mid-sized organizations are exempt. It does not exempt governments and nonprofits. From a liability standpoint, not a lawyer, this is not legal advice, but it would be good for large and mid-sized libraries to understand GDPR compliance and how to avoid problems. But to me, personally, it's more than that. Your library cred is at stake, you know. GDPR is the leading edge for online privacy. As mentioned earlier, the Library Bill of Rights now includes an article strictly about privacy, and the model itself, privacy by design and personal ownership of data, aligns well with the other values of the Library Bill of Rights. People are expecting more of those who handle their data and better data hygiene. So changes to U.S. law are pretty likely, and already our host state of California has passed its own privacy legislation to go into effect next year. If you like equal time on this issue, the Federalist Society published a lengthy blog post about GDPR and what the Federalist Society takes as its flaws and alternative solutions for the U.S. So if you want to know kind of like other alternatives, there are some that can be found. So back to what this might mean for library folks who code or who are code adjacent. So taking another look at the GDPR data rights, stemming from the data subject, that's you, owning the data. So the right to know what data is collected and how it's used. So how are we sharing with our customers, our patrons, what data we're collecting about them? The right to know when that data has been breached, which for myself involves starting to get an idea of like, when has our data potentially been breached? How do we assess that? The right to object to how data is used and contest its use. How would you handle a request like that? The right to correct data that's wrong. So when it's basic information in an ILS, that's pretty simple, but that could go deeper. The right to portability. If I want to move my data from one system to another, how do I do it? And last but not least, the right to be forgotten. Where catalog checkouts are concerned among libraries, this is the default. My right to be forgotten wins over all other concerns. So how is that right, or how are any of these rights represented in the systems that we build and use? How are these rights honored in server logs, in event registrations, in Wi-Fi sessions? These are pretty big questions. And as a web developer, I'm only now beginning to process what it might mean for our library's internal systems. And I encourage you to consider how systems you build or manage can live by the precepts of privacy by design. So what can you do? Some examples: educate your patrons. Help them learn about their own privacy rights and how to safeguard their privacy. Ask vendors about GDPR compliance. Even if that doesn't necessarily apply, it is a mechanism that can be in place for many vendors that could help protect the rights of your customers and your patrons. Among those, portability and the right to be forgotten are the ones that can probably be the trickiest. Notify users about intrusions. This isn't something that anyone really wants to do, but when an issue arises, it's important to be forthcoming. Be clear about data collection. I think for my own institution, if our pages load Google Analytics or the Facebook pixel, we should say so. And consider the GDPR model of one institutional data protection officer and a privacy governance model. So, thank you. So here's some, oh, that disappeared. Can you put the slides back on? Sorry, no? Oh, they're there. Okay, sorry. Okay, so here's some resources. The first one is the Privacy by Design at Ryerson. The second is ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom, information about GDPR, a couple of sites that are not official sites, but information about this, and then New York Public's digital safety website. These are all on the slide deck, so if you're interested, you can find them there. Here are a variety of articles that I found as I was researching this issue that I thought I would share. Some people who helped me out in this process. Bill Martin at New York Public had a good conversation with me. My boss, Amy Cavanis, who encouraged me to attend. Boxwell Lodge, that's the pond up in the Rockies, Brewster Tours. So any questions or?
Hi, thanks. So Northeastern University is in the process of starting up a campus in London. Not to put you in Theresa May's shoes, but do you have any sense of what is not going to happen with Brexit?
Well,
because England would no longer be in the EU, but do you have a sense of what might be happening there?
that's true. I have no idea. That is an excellent point. I think that would be well worth considering, and if I were at an institution with a presence in England, I would assume GDPR coverage until you know otherwise, personally.
Have you taken any steps, specific steps, to address the things like patrons that want to keep track of their own books? You know, our ILSs allow that now, the discovery layers allow that. They're opt-in mostly.
Right.
But do you have any kind of advice for, you know, how to handle that? Because it is an issue. I mean, maybe education.
Yeah, I think so. I think that education is part of that. Quick answer to that is no. But that is a growing expectation, I think, in publics, is patrons want to see their borrowing history. And we need to educate them about why that's not the default. And if our catalog system provides an option for them to collect it, how to go about that. I think that if you looked at presentations by Dr. Kavukian, she would probably suggest that in a positive-sum world, we may be able to offer both security and privacy when, you know, we're potentially safeguarding our patrons from subpoena powers, maybe we're rightly erring on the side of caution.
Thank you for explaining the GDPR. I have two questions. First, is there a list says which vendor has been GDPR compliant? Second, is there auditing process ensure the vendor are GDPR compliant if they claim so?
How do you ensure that a vendor is GDPR compliant, and what?
Whether there's a list of vendors that are GDPR compliant?
That's a pretty good question. I'm not sure. I think where it's a matter of checking whether they are, I would try to go back to the enforcement board, maybe, and see if they have information about that. And I would have to just like rely on local testing. I'm not sure about ways to verify compliance at this point. And I really, to be honest, in researching for this, the most information that I could find about suits was about some of the large suits that you've seen in the news. Even smaller compliance actions have been hard to discover. Okay.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about some of the work you did in your own institution to clear any logs or turn off any logging, just doing an internal privacy audit, like say self-check SIP logs, things like that?
Yeah, I can tell you really quickly, not a whole lot, because we're just kind of getting into that at our own institution. So we're kind of starting to look at like how frequently are we going to clear logs, how are we going to do that, and then looking at how do we remove that data downstream. So we're just now exploring that. So it's just kind of a gradual process. Sorry, I don't have better information for you. Okay. Good. Okay, thank you.
Next up, we have Carly Spina with Get to Know WCAG 2.1.
Oh, that's the end. Sorry, I don't know how it ended up at the end. There we go. Okay. And Control L. So that should be good on the screens. Yeah. Hello, everyone. So today I'm going to be talking about WCAG 2.1. Hopefully some of you are already familiar with WCAG and maybe even in the new release, but this is just going to be a very quick overview given the amount of time that we have about what these changes are and some things that I think that they're instructive in helping us to think about when we consider web accessibility more generally. So first of all, what is WCAG? So many of you are probably familiar with this. It's Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. They come from W3C. And their goal is to provide a single shared standard for web content accessibility that meets the needs of individuals, organizations, and governments internationally. Needless to say, that is an incredibly large goal. Individuals, particularly, and organizations might have very competing needs and desires in this area. There are many people with different types of disabilities who use different types of assistive devices and who have different types of needs for web content to be accessible to them. And there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do a lot of things out on the internet, usually quite cheaply, and they aren't always going to have the same goals as those people's. So it can be very difficult to come up with a single set of guidelines that meets everyone's needs. So what is WCAG 2.1 specifically? Well, it was released in the summer of 2018, and it builds on WCAG 2.0, so it's not replacing it. It's actually something where if you're already in compliance with WCAG 2.0, it's just building additional 17 new success criteria onto that. And those 17 new success criteria are across all levels. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the way WCAG works, there are 3 levels. There's level A, there's level AA, and there's level AAA or AAA, they call it. And basically level A is the lowest level of compliance, and AAA is the highest level of compliance. There really is no single standard that everyone complies with. Different organizations might pick different goals for themselves, particularly if they've never done web accessibility work in the past. But I would say that in my experience working in academic institutions, primarily, I've seen a lot that select level AA as their goal. But of course, anything that you can do above that is only going to make your content more accessible to a wider range of users. And one new advance for WCAG 2.1 is a commitment to having user examples available for each of the new success criteria, which means that they have little descriptions of how this new success criteria might impact someone in real life using the technology. It's important to remember when looking at those user examples, however, I think that for somebody who's new to web accessibility, they can almost be a little bit confusing because you might think to yourself, okay, so I'm designing for that specific person. And in fact, that's just one example, sort of like the way you might use a persona is how they analogize to it. And the examples that they provide are not necessarily intended to be exhaustive. They're just intended to give you a sense for some of these things about why it might be important. So why did they decide that there was a need for WCAG 2.1? Well, they really cite 2 main needs. And this is part of the area where I think it's instructive beyond mere compliance. Because I think that these 2 subsets of reasons for creating WCAG 2.1 are really instructive about why web accessibility is a continually ongoing process, and also what we should be thinking about when we're seeking to make things accessible and usable rather than merely compliant with whatever the standards at our organization might be. First, new technologies have emerged. They cite particularly mobile technologies, but new technologies have emerged since WCAG 2.0 was designed. And so the existing standards weren't necessarily targeted to what the big types of technology out there that are important to users and used by a lot of people are. And I think that this is one continual issue with focusing on whatever might be the current minimal legal compliance for web accessibility is, which is that new technology is always emerging. Legal standards, web accessibility guidelines, they tend to by necessity be looking backwards to some degree. They're looking at what exists at the point in time at which they were created, and they might try to some degree, anticipate the future, but particularly with legal standards, that's often very difficult to do. And so whenever you're thinking about how can we make this new tool compliant, I would encourage you to also think, yeah, but how can we make it also really, really usable to somebody who might have a disability? So don't just think to yourself, well, this is what the guidelines tell me is the minimum. Think about, well, why are the guidelines maybe not necessarily going far enough, and how might we go further? And the second thing that they cite for why WCAG 2.1 was necessary is because they admit that some types of disabilities, people with some types of disabilities were underserved, some types of disabilities were underconsidered. And they say specifically, particularly visual and cognitive disabilities, but I think it's fair to say that there were other types of disabilities that also weren't necessarily adequately represented in the guidelines that they had put forth. And I think this is also very instructive that they admit this for those of us who are committed to web accessibility, because I think this is also a very common situation. I think that we often have a picture in our mind, for whatever reason, about what we think of as a person or a user with a disability. Maybe it's somebody that we've worked with in the past. Maybe it's based on the user testing with the populations that are at our institution at that point in time. And it's important to think about who you might not be considering and whose needs you might not necessarily be meeting as you're trying to make your content as accessible as possible. So I wanted to talk about the major theme. With 17 new success criteria, there's not really time to go through each one in detail, but I think that there are some themes that are, again, things that can go beyond merely complying with these guidelines and be themes that we should keep in mind as we're doing any sort of accessibility work. So I want to break these down into these themes. So the first one is flexibility. And that's always going to be a key. If you make something that's flexible for users, it's going to be something that people with as many different types of needs can use in the way that they need to. So specifically, there are success criteria that focus on flexibility of display, that your content should be able to be displayed in ways that allow for changes in device orientation, so that if someone is using a device that they want to be able to use in landscape rather than portrait, that's something that your content can adjust to. It should allow flexibility of display of text, so that the text, for example, reflows when resized. Rather than having it stream off the screen, it should instead reformat itself and reflow so that you can still comfortably read it at a much larger text size. It should allow customization of spacing. If the user decides that there's a certain amount of line spacing, character spacing, or paragraph spacing that works better for them, that should be something that your content can allow without causing problems in usability. And animations should be able to be disabled, because that's another thing where it can affect the way things are displayed. It can interact poorly with assistive devices. It should also allow for flexibility of interaction. And so you should allow customization of interaction as much as possible. And this means that users should be able to customize keyboard shortcuts, pointer gestures that work specifically for them, the way that pointer events are canceled, for example, as well. And functionality should not be totally dependent on device motion. So even if the device is, for example, in a stand that is attached to something else, it should still be able to have the full functionality. You should be able to choose other ways of interacting with it. So an example of this might be the sort of classic, you can shake your phone to go back or to delete something. There needs to be an alternative for that as well. And it should offer multiple modes of input, and you should be able to switch between those easily. So if someone wants to input with a keyboard, whether they want to then switch back and forth to inputting with perhaps voice, they should be able to go back and forth between those as seamlessly as possible without having it break your content. In addition, all target sizes should be thought of to be as large as possible, basically, I would argue, but basically large enough that they should be usable for those who might be, have limited dexterity, who might, for whatever reason, have limited sort of attention to devote to your thing, and so are just sort of poking quickly. It should not be something that involves finding a very, very small target. And I think a lot of this goes to general usability, too. I'm sure all of us have had those times when we're hunting around for a tiny target and wondering why in the world it had to be so small. Clarity is the next big theme, the big overarching theme of these guidelines. And what do I mean by clarity? Well, clarity of purpose. So the purpose of the content should not only be able to be determined by someone reading your page, but it should also be programmatically determinable. And that is so that people who are using assistive devices or are interacting with your content in ways you may not have contemplated will still be able to understand it. So that means things like input fields for forms, icons, UI elements, regions, any visual labels and labels that are read programmatically should match. So if the visual label for your form says location and then programmatically when you pull it up it says city or something like that, that's a problem. They should really match each other so that you're getting the same information no matter how you're interacting with the content. And there should be clear status messages that can be seen programmatically. So if someone's using an assistive device to interact with your content, if there's a status pop-up, is that going to also be something that they're automatically told about? Or is that, in a sense, completely unknown to them? Are they unable to interact with that because there's no way for them to even know that it popped up? You should also be thinking about visual clarity. So content should be designed so that it is clear for users. This goes back to what we were talking about text reflowing. As people make changes so that they can customize how they look at things, it should remain clear. This is something that you may think is already part of the standards, which is that visuals should be sufficiently high contrast, because we have talked in web accessibility about contrast a lot. But actually what's added here is that visuals, graphics, any sort of visual elements are now specifically set to the same high contrast standards that they were in the past, limited to text and certain other items. So it's basically taking that desire for things to be high contrast and broadening it out to more types of content. And luckily it's applying basically the same standards, but I think that that's something that's a pretty easy goal and one that would help a lot of people in a lot of different scenarios. And also, as discussed before, spacing should be customizable. So make sure that when you're thinking about, well, it's visually clear, it's not just visually clear for you, but it's allowing your user to make it visually clear for themselves as well. And then the third big theme is about any sort of moving or timed content that you might have on your site. And this has to do with things that appear only upon focus or when you hover on something, making sure that that content is accessible and ensuring that the content appearing upon a hover or focus is dismissible, that it's easy to continue to hover upon it and not have it go away, and that it has sort of a persistence to it that makes sense, that you know how to make it stay, you know how to make it go away easily. It's very intuitive. And this has to be something that you can do both by physically interacting with it and by programmatically interacting with the content. And timed content. I think a lot of times maybe we don't really necessarily think about this, but ensure that any content with a time limit that will result in loss of data is predictable and sufficiently long for ease of use. How many times have we been trying to order something and you get that little pop-up for tickets, for example, that says the countdown until you're going to lose your tickets, and you're scrambling around thinking, why didn't I get my credit card before I started this process? And so basically you want to be thinking when you set those deadlines about what a reasonable amount of time is that isn't going to cause unnecessary stress and strain for your user. Is it predictable? Does it have that countdown clock? If it does, would someone using an assistive device know that it has that? Is the data going to be persistent if you did time them out? Are they going to lose their data, and do they know that fact? Are all important things to be keeping in mind. So now that we've talked a little bit about WCAG 2.1, I want to talk about what's next as well, because I think that's another important thing for us to think about, so that, again, we're not just thinking about minimum compliance, but we're thinking about how can we go beyond that, what should we be thinking about in the future. Well, first of all, right now, WCAG 2.1 is just at its starting phases of adoption. 3 European standards organizations have actually already updated their standards to include WCAG 2.1, but it's quite possible that that's not the case for your organization yet, or for organizations that you look to decide your standards. But I think it is likely that other groups will adopt this over time. So I would say that at this point in time, it's something for your organization to be thinking about when you decide what accessibility standards you are going with. Think to yourself, not only what level of WCAG 2.0, but what success criteria of WCAG 2.1 are you prepared to sort of adopt as things that you say are minimal to what you'll consider accessible at your organization. And then looking to the future more broadly, W3C's Accessibility Guidelines Working Group, which has developed WCAG 2.1, has already said that they're in the process of developing a new major version. And this will include not only additions, potentially, but it's also going to be major restructuring of how things are done. And it's going to be based a lot more on user testing and feedback, with a goal of increased flexibility for developers, but also a goal of increased flexibility, I think, for end users to be able to access content most easily. So I think that that's the thing to think about going forward, is that there are going to be continued changes, but there are clearly actionable work that we can do now based on WCAG 2.1. And I think that the fact that the Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is sort of calling out how they're going to be looking at user testing and feedback is a good reminder to us that that's how really accessibility practice works best, is to work with people who are already making use of these features that we're building in and doing user testing with people who have disabilities, with people who use assistive devices, and make sure that we're making our products as accessible as possible for them. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might have, or you can always talk to me later. If anybody would like to see the slides online, because I know the PDF version might not be as accessible as some other options, they're available here as well. Oh, yeah. There's a question. Oh, yeah.
Always glad to see accessibility talks at Code4Lib that are not by me, so thank you, first of all. But one of the topics in 2.1 you did not get into is the ongoing discussion about whether videos should have action descriptions in them. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, I think a lot about how to make accessible videos, because I think people talk about captions, but they don't really talk about audio description or action descriptions very much at all. And I think it's an important thing for libraries to consider and for all sorts of organizations to consider. Personally, I think that they should be added. I think that goes back to what I was saying about it not necessarily being solely, in my mind, about compliance and being more about true accessibility. So it is important to know that if you provide a video as the only way of getting at certain content, and a lot's happening on the screen that you can't get from listening to the audio, there is this idea of creating audio descriptions that say, as an additional track, what's happening on the screen. And when I give other longer talks, I actually have an example of that. So if anyone's interested in seeing what it looks like, I can send you an example. And there's a great free tool for creating that. So if your library is looking at creating a lot of videos, I would encourage you to also look into Cadet, which can help you to create those separate tracks. The one thing I would additionally say about audio description and action descriptions for videos is that it's important to think about, too, I think, what it means to truly make a video meaningful to somebody who might be using an assistive device. So for example, you also want to think about, if it's a tutorial for a database, for example, is the interaction with that database for someone who's using certain types of assistive devices quite a bit different? And if so, what support can you offer beyond just a video tutorial that might describe to them a process that's totally different than what they'll use to interact with the database, for example? So it might mean saying specifically that you offer one-on-one support. It might mean creating a separate tutorial that says, here's how you interact with database X using this type of assistive device or that type of assistive device. But I think that's an important thing to also consider when you want to truly make this content accessible. Any other questions?
Yes. Over on this side.
Oh, okay.
Hello. Putting together your talk with the previous one, it occurs to me that if we provide the kind of customizations that you're describing, it would be, if we're not very careful, much easier to specifically identify, for example, a search that's conducted by someone who's making use of these sorts of supports within our, by searching the weblogs or whatever. They can much more easily be specifically identified. I'm wondering if there has to, if you're aware of any thought or guidance or principles in how to both provide these sorts of accessibility supports while protecting the privacy of the people who are making use of them.
Well, a lot of the supports aren't necessarily so much about allowing customization, like you log in to your website and you can say, I want the text to be this size, I want the text to be that size, I want the spacing to be different. It's more about making sure that if on their devices side they have the default set up to allow to be that way, to be larger text on their phone, for example, that your site doesn't break with that your site allows for reflow and those sorts of things. So a lot of times it's not actually going to be stored anywhere, and it's not necessarily going to be data that you have to worry about. However, I do think it's important to be thinking about people's data, and that goes back, I think, more to whether, like, the difference between collecting the data in the short term and storing it. So I think that to some extent you might be able to get information about when people are using certain types of assistive devices to interact with your pages, but it's whether or not that you store that information. That's probably the bigger question, though I'm not an expert in GDPR. Yes.
I'm wondering if there are examples out there of sites that are doing accessibility correctly, like really well. Because as a developer, a lot of times I just want to see, okay, who's doing it, who's doing a good job, so that I can copy them.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know off the top of my head of a list of sites I would point to as the exemplars, though it's possible that someone has created those. I think that along with the WCAG guidelines on their website, you can find some information about testing, and they may have some examples of sites. But part of the problem, I think, with that is that sites change so frequently that even if you say, well, today it's working, if they do an update, it would be hard to say whether it's something you can still sign off on. I will say that I know that some libraries in the Big Ten have started working together for library vendor reports about accessibility that they post online publicly. So not necessarily all of those are examples of what's perfect, but they are examples of somebody having done evaluations and then writing them up. And in some cases, the vendors have written responses saying what they've done to change things or what they think about what was said about them. So that might be instructive for someone looking to learn more about accessibility from a database in particular, or any resource side of things. Any other questions? Okay, well, anyone can ask me questions later if you have any. Oh, wait, there's one more. Okay.
Just a real quick question. And this will show my naivete, I guess, but I've always thought that, like, compliance with Section 508, if I was, WCAG 2.0 AA or AAA compliant, I was living up to the spirit of Section 508. Does the ground change? Is there a big shift, do you think, now that it's 2.1?
Well, I mean, nothing is meant that, I can't really give you legal advice about what is going to be accepted because it's really hard to know without seeing how courts respond or what the standard is when people file complaints with the DOJ going forward. But I suspect that eventually over time, because there was never really a truly formal adoption, it's always been more of a general standard, that level AA will probably sort of remain what people aim for, whether it's because that's the legal standard or just because it's what people have generally found works for them. But I do think that people are increasingly going to move towards adopting the WCAG 2.1. I'm just not sure how quickly. And the reason why I think that'll happen is because it's already starting to happen with the European standards, and so much web content needs to meet standards everywhere that I think people will probably just start trending in that direction rather than creating different branches that meet the standards for different organizations they work with. Thank you.
Okay, we now have a 15-minute break. There will be coffee and teas just outside the conference hall. If you are one of the lightning talkers who is speaking directly after this and you have slides, please come up to the podium computer so we can get those loaded.